page 26a, Talmud Brochos. Yesterday we began the new chapter, chapter 4, and we spoke about the laws of praying the Shemona Esrei, davening the Shemona Esrei, and what the deadline is for the morning prayer, the afternoon prayer, the night prayer, the Musaf prayer. And for the morning davening, Shacharis, we said the deadline is either midday or until the 4th hour of the day, 2 opinions. Mincha, there were 2 opinions. First opinion was until Erev, which that itself is debatable what that means, until Erev. We mentioned the opinion of Rabbeinu Yoina, that it means until Shkia, until sunset. And we also mentioned the opinion of Rashi, which is ad chashecha, until it's dark, which possibly means much later than sunset, possibly 58.5 minutes after sunset, which would be which would be called the end shkia, the end of this of sunset. In other words, there's an understanding, there's an opinion that explains that there's a beginning of sunset and an end of sunset. The beginning of sunset is what we call sunset, and the end would be 58.5 minutes after that, and it leaves us 3/4 of a mil, which is 13.5 minutes, to be considered Bein Hashmasha, is the time that's gray, that we don't know if it's day or night. So that's the understanding of the first opinion of Ad Ha'erev, until evening. And then we had the opinion of Reb Yehuda that says until Plag HaMincha, until halfway through Mincha. And the Gemara will debate what Mincha refers to. Is it the big Mincha or the small Mincha? There's a Mincha Gedola and a Mincha Ketana. Mincha Gedola was 6.5 hours into the day, which means there's 5.5 hours left of the day. And if you divide that in half, that would be the deadline for Mincha. Or it means the Mincha Ketana, which means 9.5 hours into the day, which means there's 3.5 hours left of the day. And during that 3.5 hours left of the day, you divide that in half. And the first half would be the time for Mincha. And you would, from then, you would be allowed to daven Ma'ariv. You would start praying the night service from then. Now, it doesn't mean that it's fully night, but it would be night regarding prayer, regarding tefillah. That tefillah would be acceptable from that moment, from that time, halfway through what's called mincha. And we mentioned that is the source of making an early Shabbos. That because you could daven Ma'ariv early, you could do the early Shabbos, and that would be the source. It's relying on this opinion of Plag HaMincha. And I also mentioned that Plag HaMincha is also applicable on a regular basis. If someone wants to light Shabbos candles or accept Shabbos early, you can accept Shabbos early up to Plag HaMincha, up to that time of Plag HaMincha. We also spoke about the fact that there are 2 opinions, even though we're emphasizing that everything goes by sunrise to sunset, but there is also an additional opinion, the Magen Avram, that says everything goes by dawn to dusk, which does mess up our calculations. It changes things around, and there are some people that are careful and strict to follow that view as well. The Magen Avram's view to say Shema earlier. According to his view, it ends up that the time to recite Shema is about 36 minutes before the other opinion. And so some people are careful in that, to follow that view, especially for Shema. Regarding saying davening Ma'ariv, I mentioned that there's different views with regard to when is the earliest time that a person could recite the Ma'ariv service. The one opinion that we mentioned a little earlier was the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam, 72 minutes after sunset. Now, I must say that's a more extreme view. Not everyone follows that. That's a very extreme view, that they would wait 72 minutes after sunset to do the night service. But there is such a view, and there are many people that do go by that. But the common view is to rely on the first sunset, which is what we call sunset, and then just to wait about 25 or 30 minutes after that for night to be considered fully night. So it's a difference. It's a huge difference between waiting 30 minutes after sunset or waiting 72 minutes after sunset. It really. But there are such views, and especially regarding Shabbos, some people that maybe all year round they're not so careful to say Shema later and daven Ma'ariv after 72 minutes. But some people would be more careful when it comes to Shabbos, that they don't want to transgress any prohibitions until a later time regarding Shabbos. Everyone is obligated to add on to the Shabbos, and we do take a stricter view. Everyone takes the stricter view regarding Shabbos, but some take a much more stricter view, which would be that 72 minutes or so. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say I'm getting the feeling that really applies to both cases, whether you pray by yourself or in the synagogue with a group, that you have to keep those times.
You're correct. The times don't really fluctuate, although there is one point that should be mentioned, and that is that there are leniencies. If you go to shul, many shuls are lenient, and they'll do a mincha and a ma'ariv right after. And the reason for that, which in the Talmudic literature, it's called tarti desasri. It's called two opposites, because if you're davening mincha, how are you davening ma'ariv? It doesn't make sense. You're contradicting yourself. But at the same time, it's allowed for synagogues, but it wouldn't be allowed for an individual. Why is it allowed for a synagogue? Because it's a toirach lekabtzon. It's too much of a bother to gather. The people are not going to come. They're going to miss having a minyan, and therefore, even though it's a contradiction, it's acceptable. It's not preferable, but it's acceptable in certain communities where they're really bending over backwards just to come to shul. So you're gonna to keep them in shul for a half hour, they're not going to end up. They won't come back. So therefore,
accommodate them.
So therefore, it would be acceptable. But of course, everyone should say the Shema later on their own to at least fulfill the Shema in its time. That Shema should be recited 100% in its proper time. So even though you're davening Ma'ariv too early, nevertheless, that would be okay. Now, the proper way to do it, if someone wanted to do this in an acceptable way and daven early, there is a way to do it. And that would be to daven mincha right before plag ha-mincha, which would be, yesterday we said the time was 6:42. So if you daven mincha at 6:30, then you could jump right into Ma'ariv at 6:42. So you could do it in a proper way in a shul if you did it on a daily basis that way and follow Rabbi Yehuda's view, which the Gemara says is okay. That if you want to follow Rabbi Yehuda, you can. The Gemara allows it. We could follow him or we could follow the other opinion. Either way is acceptable. So that would be the acceptable way to do it. The problem with that, going that path, is that it does fluctuate. So it's not like you can say the same time every day for mincha. You can't, you wouldn't be able to give like a set time. Every day would be different, be a few minutes different. Yes, Mel. You're muted. You have to unmute. Just press unmute on the bottom left.
What I also noticed, that we have a Sephardic minyan here in Surfside. So they daven mincha and ma'ariv usually at 7 o'clock. They're finished about 7:40. But it also occurred to me that a lot of they're much younger guys. So of course they have little kids at home and all of that. So it also is helpful because they get home and, they're able to help get the kids to sleep and sometimes for the homework, whatever. So I always thought it was a good idea for that purpose too, to keep, things so that the children get a little more, sometimes they need a little discipline. And if you're, if the father is away, that's generally who gives the discipline. So I always thought it was a good idea on that level too.
Right. In other words, another reason why there should be leniency to daven Ma'ariv. But I will say in larger communities, there is an alternative, and that is that they have a late Ma'ariv, like 10 o'clock after everyone's sleeping. You can go out and daven Ma'ariv and have no problem. So you can do the mincha and then just run home. But in any event, that is the source of all these laws is our Mishnah here, our Mishnah and our Gemara. Now, we also mentioned that Musaf, the Mishnah says you have all day to daven Musaf. Rabbi Yehuda says until 7 hours. The question if Rabbi Yehuda's statement is meant to be written here in the Mishnah or it's later on in the Gemara and the Talmud when the Talmud brings a brisa. It's a little unclear. Different opinions if it's supposed to be, if the correct print is supposed to be to have Rabbi Yehuda or not. That's why it's in parentheses. Now, we did talk about the fact that Ma'ariv is considered a reshus. It's not an obligation, or wasn't an obligation. And I mentioned to you that our Gemara does imply that it is an obligation, because it tells you that if you miss it, you got to make it up. You got to do two. You got to make it up and do a double shacharis if you miss the Ma'ariv. And so we spoke a little about the fact that Ma'ariv used to be a reshus. It was we spoke about the opinion of Tosfos. Tosfos holds that Ma'ariv is only considered reshus, which means it's permissible. It's not it's not obligatory. It's only not obligatory if you have another mitzvah that's pressing. But Tosfos holds that if you don't have another mitzvah that's pressing, then you would be obligated to daven Ma'ariv. That is Tosfos's view. There are other views that say that Ma'ariv is considered a reshus. It's something that was not accepted. It was not an obligation, but it became accepted as an obligation, and because of that, it's the Jewish people accepted it on themselves, and we are obligated to daven Ma'ariv. Now it's an obligation. So there's two views. Is it that it used to be totally permissible, you didn't have to daven it at all, or did you have to daven it just if you had another pressing mitzvah? That would have been a good, an excuse that you could have taken, done the important mitzvah and pushed off the davening of Ma'ariv. Now, there is a discussion regarding in Ma'ariv, would a person be allowed to make an announcement that everyone should remember to say, it's Rosh Chodesh, remember to say the Ya'aleh V'Yaveh. Are you allowed to make such an announcement in Ma'ariv? And the reason behind it, the reason why you might be allowed to make an announcement, again, in the night service, there's an additional paragraph that's added for Ya'aleh V'Yaveh for Rosh Chodesh. And in the morning prayer and the afternoon prayer as well, there's an additional paragraph that has to be added. The morning prayer, you definitely cannot interrupt. At least the way the common halacha, people make a bang on the bima, on the table to remind people to say it, but you don't actually interrupt with words for the morning prayer. In the afternoon prayer, mincha, a person is allowed to interrupt because all you did was said ashrei. But regarding Ma'ariv, that's where there's a question, because Ma'ariv, the night service, maybe because it's not a full-fledged obligation, maybe you would be able to interrupt. It's called a reshus. It wasn't an obligation. So there might be room to say that you could interrupt. Now, if we think about it, there's a difference between the two reasons that I just explained. According to Tosfos, you're not allowed to interrupt unless you have a pressing mitzvah. It's really an obligation to daven Ma'ariv. But if you have a mitzvah that's pressing, then you could push off your obligation. According to that, there might be it would seem that you would not be allowed to interrupt the Ma'ariv to say Ya'aleh v'yavai, because and make an announcement, because you're obligated to daven Ma'ariv, and Ma'ariv has a Ma'ariv is an obligation. That means you're supposed to connect Geula to Tefillah. You can't interrupt between the Geula and Tefillah because Ma'ariv is an obligation. If Ma'ariv is an obligation, then okay, if you had another mitzvah, you could push off Ma'ariv. But Ma'ariv has a law that you're not allowed to interrupt, and you have an obligation. So there would be reason to say that Ma'ariv you should not be interrupting. You should not be interrupting. However, according to the other opinion, that you're really not obligated in Ma'ariv. It's just the Jewish people accepted to daven Ma'ariv. If that's the case, then you don't really have an obligation to connect Geula and Tefillah. You could really interrupt before the, you could really interrupt in order to, and separate between Geula and Tefillah, and therefore you would be allowed to possibly make that interruption and say Ya'aleh v'yavai. So that's an interesting difference between these two views. So that basically is, I think, covers the at least the Mishnah part of our review. Now the Gemara said that the mitzvah to daven with Neitz Hachama, that you would daven you would say the Shema and then the Shemona Esrei right at sunrise, and that seemed to contradict our Mishnah, because our Mishnah implied you have until midday or until 4 hours. So the Gemara answers that that's for Vasikin, that's really for pious people, that they daven the perfect time, the auspicious time, right by sunrise, right away, and they are doing something unique, but that's not that's very nice, but that's not the letter of the according to the law. You're allowed to daven until 4 hours of the day or until midday. And then the Gemara asked another contradiction. It said, "What? Well, we know you're allowed to daven. You can make up later. You could do 2 Ma'arivs, 2 Minchas, 2 Shachrises. You could daven later if you miss up a prayer. So why does it say only until noon or until 4 hours? You could always do a makeup." And the Gemara answers that if you do a makeup, it's you don't get the full reward. The reward of davening in its time you don't have. And commentaries mention that the meaning behind this is that when you daven in the right time, it is exactly as if, or is similar to, it is as if you brought a sacrifice. If you daven later, this is an understanding of what the Gemara means. What reward are you getting if you daven in the right time versus if you wait till later and you do 2 minchas? What is the difference? So the difference is, according to one commentary, that if you daven in the right time, not only are you doing the prayer, but you're also getting a reward for bringing a sacrifice. Unashalma farim sefasenu, that our lips are fulfilling our covering as if we brought a sacrifice. We brought it is as if we brought a parim, a bull, and so that is the special reward for davening in its time. If you daven later, in other words, if you do a makeup, so you're not getting that reward. You're going to get a reward for davening, but you don't get a reward for doing for davening in its time and getting like bringing the sacrifice. Now, yesterday, Ezra asked about when you do daven twice. When you daven twice, we mentioned that you're supposed to daven if you do a makeup, you're supposed to daven both of the prayers you daven the obligatory prayer first, and then you do the makeup right afterwards. And the question was, what happens if you didn't do it right afterwards? Would you be allowed to do the makeup later on? And this is a debate among the achrayim, among the commentaries, because it depends there's the wording that's given is that you're supposed to do it in the time of prayer, of that next prayer. Now, it either means the time when you did the other prayer, or it means as long as it's still the appropriate time of the next prayer, you could still do the makeup. So because of this, there's a debate among the commentaries if you can do a makeup if you missed it. If you let's say you missed the morning prayer, you're davening the afternoon prayer, and you did the afternoon prayer. Then later on, an hour later, you remember, oh yeah, I never did the morning prayer. So can you make up the morning prayer? This is a debate among the commentaries. Now, there is the Mishnah Berurah does bring two things. The number one, he says preferably you should do the makeup prayer right away. But if you don't, you could make it up. You could do it afterwards. In other words, there's enough to rely on, enough opinions to rely on that you could recite it afterwards. Harbe achronim, he says, many of the later codifiers agree that even though preferably you should do it right away, but b'diavad, if the time of the prayer, the second prayer, hasn't passed, then you could still do the makeup. But then he gives a third option. He gives an additional option. And what's the other option? That you could make a condition when you do the prayer, and that is based on another concept, that you could make a condition when you pray. Now, what is that based on? It's based on the fact that you could do what's called a tfilas nedava. We've spoken about this before, that a person could do a gift prayer. So what you could do is recite the makeup prayer. Let's say you missed the morning prayer. You're doing the afternoon prayer twice. In the afternoon prayer, you already did, and now an hour later, you want to do the makeup for the morning prayer. So you have in mind that I'm doing a makeup for the morning prayer if I'm allowed to. If I'm not allowed to, this should be a makeup. This should be a makeup prayer for this should be a gift prayer, not a makeup. A gift prayer, it'll be considered a tfilas nidava. So that would be the other option to do this. Now, so that's to answer Ezra's question. Now, Ben also mentioned about what about a shliach tzibur? What happens if a person is the chazan and he needs to daven twice? He missed the earlier prayer, and now he's the chazan. He doesn't want to tell everyone that he's going to do 3 Shemona Esreis there. So the law is you don't have to do 3. The second, shliach tzibur can fulfill his makeup prayer by believe it or not, it sounds surprising, but he can do his makeup prayer as his loud prayer, his prayer that he's doing in public. That can be his makeup prayer. So that's very interesting. It's a radvaz. But it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that would be allowed. So you would only have to do you would do you just do the repetition, and that would be considered fulfillment of the obligation. Now, according to that, you have another option. Person who missed. No, you don't have another option. Actually, if you're davening now, so there's no problem. You for sure could daven another Shemona Esrei. Right. Okay. That doesn't add. There is an option to be the chazan and but normally in that scenario, you don't really need an excuse, because you just davened the regular Shemona Esrei. Now you're going to repeat it. So it's really you could do this on your own. You don't need to be a chazan. It doesn't really help you so much. Yes. Yes, Yehuda. Yehuda.
Yeah. Is that the accepted opinion?
I think so. It's brought in the Magen Avraham. It's a radvaz. Yeah. It seems like it's. I didn't look in the Mishnah Berurah, but I believe it's. It's very well sourced. Let me see if it mentions it in the regular Shulchan Aruch here. Now, I did want to mention another thing. We're going to be learning about if a person makes a mistake versus if he on purpose doesn't daven. Now, what does that mean? On purpose, he didn't daven, and what's called a mistake. And so, since we're going to learn that, I want to go over that, and but I see my time is up. We're so limited with time. So I guess we're going to do that tomorrow. Let me just finish the review then, and we'll do that tomorrow. We'll go over what that means, the different according to halacha. What does it mean a mistake and what does it mean on purpose? But let me finish going over the review. So we mentioned that if a person makes a mistake and doesn't misses one of the services, he's allowed to do a makeup. Farah asked, does that apply to mincha? Because if you miss mincha, it's like another day. Davening Ma'ariv twice, it's like a different day. And a different day, maybe it doesn't work. On the other hand, the Gemara says, well, davening is just asking Hashem for mercy. So maybe it does work. So the Gemara answered that you could do a makeup. Even though it's another day, davening is mercy, is asking Hashem for mercy. And therefore, it would work to do a makeup. Now, what the Gemara on the commentaries mention here, that it seems that what we see here is that the makeup has to be right near the previous prayer, which means that you can't do a makeup later on. If you miss a prayer, let's say you missed the morning prayer and now it's night already. Can you do a makeup now for two prayers back? No. The makeup prayer is only in the next prayer, the next place where you are. That's where you can do a makeup. You can't do a makeup all the way all the way back. However, you can do a tfilas nedava. You can do a gift prayer. That would be allowed to do a gift prayer, a donation prayer where you're just reciting a prayer, but you would not be allowed to do what we call a makeup.